Good morning, scholars. Okay, this week we are going to learn about African Americans in the Civil War as soldiers. So just their role as soldiers and how the Emancipation Proclamation kind of changed their status. So I'm going to go ahead and go over a PowerPoint with you so you can get started for the week. Let me go ahead and pull that up. All right. So the Confiscation and Militia Act was a law that was passed in Congress on July 17th, 1862, freeing slaves who had masters in the Confederate Army. So this means that people who were fighting in the Confederate Army, the Southern Army, their slaves were freed by Congress, and they could go to the North and fight for the Union. This was a big deal because it mobilized a lot more soldiers. A lot of African American slaves received freedom this way, and they had to escape to the North. But once they did, they could be in the Army and serve their country. So it also seized land and property from disloyal citizens. So this means that this act that was passed seized land and property, of which slaves were property, meaning it took it away from disloyal citizens. So those people in the South who had seceded from the Union lost to this act land and property. Now, we're at war, and so their land isn't immediately taken because they are fighting for their land. So what happens then is that as the North comes down into the South with their armies, they can seize their land and property legally. And there's no way for those citizens to get their land and property back. Okay. 2 days later, on July 17th, slavery was abolished in the territories of the United States. So they added a law that said that slavery is illegal in the United States. And on July 22nd, so this is moving really quickly in 1862, on July 22nd, President Lincoln presented the preliminary draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. This means that he wrote up the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a draft, and he took it to his advisors to decide what things they wanted to edit, right? Whether they wanted to leave things out, whether they wanted to add things to it. And so on July 22nd, he presented his draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is going to emancipate, which means to free the slaves in the South. And there's a copy of it. Pretty cool. Okay, so African American recruitment then intensifies. This is just recruitment to the Army. So people are trying to get African Americans into the Army. So after the Union Army turned back Lee's first invasion of the North at the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Antietam is the Confederate Army's first invasion. Lee is the general that leads that invasion, and the Union Army turned them back. So they won that battle. And the Emancipation Proclamation was subsequently, that just means after that, was announced. And black recruitment was pursued in earnest, meaning that after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union was free to recruit African Americans into the Army. Volunteers from South Carolina, Tennessee, and Massachusetts, Maryland, filled the first authorized black regiments. Okay. Those are the states that the first African Americans came into regiment. This is an advertisement. So to colored men, 54th Regiment, Massachusetts Volunteers, African descent. Okay. $100 bounty at the expiration of the term of service. Okay. They pay them, and this for some slaves may be the first time they've ever been paid for service. They pay them $13 a month. And then they receive government aid to their families for serving. This is a big deal. Because their families, if they've escaped from slavery, their families have nothing, right? And so with government aid to families, this is a really attractive advertisement for African American slaves escaping slavery with their families to come into this because their families would be taken care of. And so that's what that advertisement is. Frederick Douglass is part of this. He's a brilliant writer. And recruitment was kind of slow for African Americans until African American leaders such as Frederick Douglass, which is this man right here, encouraged black men to become soldiers and ensure eventual full citizenship. Okay, so he encouraged them to become full soldiers and then promised that they would become full citizens of the United States, which up until this point they're not. They're not counted as human beings. They're counted as 2/3 of a human being. So 2 of Douglass's own sons contributed to the war effort. So his sons joined as soldiers in the war effort. So there was a group from the federal government set aside called the Bureau of Colored Troops. This is the Bureau of African American Troops. Colored is a word that they're using to describe men of African descent at this time. So volunteers began to respond, and in May 1863, the government established the Bureau of Colored Troops to manage the burgeoning number of black soldiers. So they established this management group to help conscript, to help the African American slaves get into the army. And there's an image. These images are amazing. So the Civil War is the first time in our time periods that we've looked at where we have actual images of the people who lived during this time. So it's so interesting to look at what they're wearing, what they look like. He looks very serious. What their uniforms are like, because we can describe uniforms, right, in the Revolutionary War, but we can really see them in the Civil War, and their means, their ways of living. So down here is are members of the Army as well. So African Americans serve admirably. That means they served well in the Army. They were good in the Army. So black soldiers served in artillery and infantry and performed all non-combat support functions that sustained the Army as well. So they served in artillery, that's cannons, right, and infantry, which is the main part of the Army, and performed all non-combat support functions. So that just means they served, right? They would serve commanders, paperwork kind of things. Some of them were illiterate, so they weren't able so much to do that kind of stuff, but they cooked. And it has a list down here below. So carpenters, chaplains are ministers, so religious services. Cooks, guards, laborers, nurses, scouts, spies, steamboat pilots, surgeons, and teamsters. And then black women could not formally join the Army. Women could not join the Army in general. But they did serve as nurses, spies, and scouts, which is so interesting. So the most famous of these women that comes up in our history books is Harriet Tubman. And she was a scout for the 22nd South Carolina Volunteers. So a scout is somebody who goes around the landscape and helps strategize and describes, how, she'll go look over the ridge at a southern group of Army members and go back and tell them how many people are there, what they're doing, what their movements are like, so that when there's a battle or an attack, the Union has additional information. So super interesting person, Harriet Tubman. There was a movie that came out. It's incredible. So she is an escaped slave as well, and she scouted for the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. And there's an image of her as well. So these are some statistics about African American soldiers in the war. So by the end of the Civil War, roughly 179,000 black men, which is 10% of the Union Army, 10%, that's pretty cool, served as soldiers in the U.S. Army, and another 19,000 served in the Navy. There were nearly 80 black commissioned officers. This is kind of an amazing thing. So African Americans are going from a servant position, from people who were looked at as not human, from people who were illiterate, and they're learning and they're growing, and 80 of them are commissioned officers, which is a big deal. It's a big deal even for Caucasian men to become an officer in the Army. And so this is an amazing change, right, from what it was. Nearly 40,000 black soldiers died over the course of the war, and 30,000 of them died of infection or disease. So infection and disease, and we'll find out a little bit more about this next week, but infection and disease are big problems during the Civil War. It's not just getting shot at. It's not just being attacked on the battlefield. Infection and disease are a big problem. Okay, serve with distinction. Distinction means that you've done something amazing that the federal government recognizes you for. Because there was some prejudice, and there was prejudice in the North too. Black units were not used in combat as extensively as they might have been, so they didn't put them into combat as much. I think there was probably a trust issue, and that's where that prejudice comes in. And then, nevertheless, the soldiers served with distinction in a number of battles. Black infantrymen fought gallantly at Milliken's Bend, Port Hudson, Petersburg, Virginia, and Nashville, Tennessee. So they were in battles, but they weren't used as extensively, which just means not as much as they could have been. There's an image of them. So there's still prejudice in the military. It's important to talk about this because it is amazing what happened with African American slaves when they went north and joined the military. But there was still a lot of prejudice going on, even in the North, right? It's not just the good guys versus the bad guys. There's prejudice and corruption and things going on in the Northern military as well. And so, in addition to the perils of war faced by all Civil War soldiers, black soldiers faced additional problems stemming from racial prejudice. So racial discrimination was prevalent even in the North, and the discriminatory practices permeated the United States military. It's another image. So as a result of prejudice, they have segregated units. So the white military people were separated from the African American military people. They felt like that was the right thing to do. So they segregated units were formed with black enlisted men and typically commanded by white officers and black non-commissioned officers. So this might look a little like slavery to them. They are being paid, but they're being led by a white officer because the feeling was that the white officer could be trusted. There's a big trust issue with African Americans. The 54th Massachusetts was commanded by Robert Shaw, and the 1st South Carolina by Thomas Wentworth, which were both white. There's another image. It's just amazing. I haven't seen these images before I started doing this unit, and I think they're just incredible. So there's the officer, and then we have our African American troops. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the 54th Regiment. In July 1863, so this is about a year after the Emancipation Proclamation, and the July 1863 assault on Fort Wagner, South Carolina, in which the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts Volunteers lost 2/3 of their officers and half of their troops, was memorably dramatized in the film Glory. So you could absolutely watch Glory. It's a great film. I would have shown some of it in class. I may show a clip of Glory, but this is where African Americans are fighting, and they lost half of their troops. A little bit about pay. So African American soldiers were initially paid $10 a month, from which $3 was automatically deducted for clothing, so they made $7. So this is normal. This happens for Caucasian troops as well. This happens today, not for clothing, But for instance, my paycheck has deductions on it for health insurance and stuff like that. So pretty regular thing for them to do. In contrast, okay, so white soldiers are making more because of this prejudice that's going on. So in contrast, white soldiers receive $13 a month, from which no clothing allowance was drawn. So they're making double what African American soldiers are making. In June 1864, Congress granted equal pay to the United States colored troops and made the action retroactive. This means that they were back paid. So when they were making $10 a month with a net pay of $7, so they're making $7. Whatever they weren't paid up to the $13, so the $6 a month that they weren't paid had to be paid back to them. This is really amazing. So they got a big chunk of money when that action was made retroactive. African American soldiers received the same rations and supplies. So in addition, they received comparable medical care. So the medical care was just as good as white soldiers. There's another image, pretty cool. So, danger of being captured. So the black troops faced greater peril than white troops when captured by the Confederate Army. So when people captured white troops in the South, they didn't see them as property. When Southerners captured black troops, they saw them as slaves. So there's a big difference in the way that they're viewed. So in 1863, the Confederate Congress, so this is the South, remember they separated into two different countries, the Confederate Congress threatened to punish severely officers of black troops and to enslave black soldiers. As a result, President Lincoln issued General Order 233, threatening reprisal on Confederate prisoners of war for any mistreatment of black troops. So, this means that Confederate soldiers who had been captured would pay the price for mistreatment of black troops. So this would be by death, this would be by imprisonment, this would be this is a serious threat. Okay, harsh treatment. So although the threat generally restrained the Confederates, so in the South, for the most part, they treated black captives like white captives, but black captives were treated more harshly. So maybe they didn't re-enslave them, but they treated them more harshly than white captives. In perhaps the most heinous known example of abuse, so the worst example of abuse, Confederate soldiers shot to death black Union soldiers captured at Fort Pillow engagement of 1864. So they just took them and shot them instead of capturing them. Confederate General Nathan B. Forrest witnessed the massacre and did nothing to stop it. So by war's end, 16 black soldiers had been awarded the Medal of Honor for their valor. The Medal of Honor is a high medal in the military. And that's it. So if you have any questions about that or want to look into it further, you are welcome to. I think it would be really interesting for you to dig into Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman at this time. We are going to do a final project, so I want you to be thinking about, as the weeks go on, what kinds of things. So last week was military strategy. Maybe that really piqued your interest, and you'd like to do that. This week we're doing African Americans as soldiers in the Civil War. Maybe that's interesting to you. And we've touched a little bit on women in the military as spies and scouts, and so you could focus on that too. So I want you to be thinking about that. This week, at the end of the week, I'm going to come out with a rubric about what that project needs to look like, and we'll start working on that. I do want to still teach lessons, and so we'll kind of have to figure it out. There will be more information this Friday about what you need to be doing and researching and looking at, and I'll provide some things for you to look at as well. So if this really piqued your interest, you can do this stuff. But this is the information that you'll need to complete the assignments for the week. Thanks, guys. I hope you have a good day.